Perhaps long, long ago, when you were just a wee ankle biter, you had a pirate phase. There's no shame in it. Those swashbuckling devils from that golden age of piracy and the centuries-old mythology constructed around them are pretty damn exhilarating. Just take the standard archetype of the pirate. A British outlaw operating in the Caribbean, uncapped charisma, total freedom, an indomitable spirit on the fringes of society. Then there's the romanticized universe of piracy, with turquoise waters, treasure-laden coasts, and rumbustious taverns with emphasis on the rum. At a time of predatory empires, even to this day, they have a Robin Hood quality about them. Many of the ships they preyed on carried treasures from state-backed looting. They kept entire countries on their toes, meting out punishments for state greed and hypocrisy. Their ships can be called microcosms of democracy, almost socialist in flavour, and they were self-governed under codes of conduct for each crew, known universally under the bracket of the Pirate Code. And yes, many of the pirates were crude, self-serving bandits and murderers, and who wants to condone bloody pirates? But what they represent still captures the imagination. Statelessness, non-conformism, individualism, while at the same time service. Their romanticized tales made them the Wild West cowboys of the day, when rampant print media, not Hollywood, brought their exhilarating tales to the masses. Anti-heroes that enthralled frustrated Europeans with limited mobility of class and geography. To this day, there's still fresh material for Hollywood, with centuries worth of pirate tropes from literature, theatre and film to choose from. Anyway, this is a bit of a long-winded soliloquy to kick off today's video, and I'm probably venturing into Michael Bolton territory here.
I'm really sorry I'm late. I just got caught up watching the Pirates of the Caribbean marathon. Have you seen those things?
Oh yeah. Those are great.
So ladies and gentlemen, here's a look at Anne Bonny, the infamous female pirate. Her first biography was written pseudonymously almost precisely 3 centuries ago by a Captain Charles Johnson. A general history of pirates, offering short, semi-legendary biographies on notable pirates, was a smash hit for the day, and is often credited with having birthed the modern mythology and continued popularity of pirates. Suffice to say, it's more literature than history, heavily dramatizing available contemporary sources, which means that most modern histories of the great pirates are filled with gaps and errors. So here's a history of Anne Bonny, but heavier on the story, and we can take out the his whilst we're at it. Take this recounting with a dollop of salt, but also enjoy that sweet, salty sea breeze as we venture into the mythical world of pirates. Fuck, can't do it. So let's delve into her emphasis alleged beginnings, starting with before she was even born. It should give you a pretty good idea of the dreadful family situation she was born into, which would overshadow much of her youth. Mary Brennan was a Catholic maid for a Mr. and Mrs. William Cormac, residents of Kinsale in the county of Cork. They had a relatively normal life as members of the landed gentry in English-ruled Ireland. Mr. Cormac was a lawyer with his own legal practice. Things got a tad heated when Mrs. Cormac discovered her dear husband was having an affair with their maid. The story goes that after suspecting the maid was polishing more than doorknobs, Mrs. Cormac dismissed Mary early and that same night lay in Mary's bed under the cover of darkness and waited, expecting the worst. Lo and behold, a wildly aroused Mr. Cormac soon stumbled in, cooing for Mary. In the silence, he proceeded to business. The ensuing immersive experience would have been somewhat enlightening to Mrs. Cormac as to her husband's fidelity. No wonder the maid was now bad news for Mrs. Cormac's, but things got worse for young Mary as we're told a jealous lover had framed the maid, placing a set of stolen silver spoons belonging to Mr. Cormac in between Mary's sheets. In a farcical and historically dubious series of events involving said spoons, Mrs. Cormac called the local authorities, using the stolen spoons as a pretense to punish her husband's mistress. Mary was promptly arrested, and adding salt to the wound for all parties, Mary was pregnant. Meanwhile, Mr. Cormac was also charged with adultery, and it's possible he, ironically the town's prestigious lawyer, served some jail time as well. Mary, though, was eventually acquitted, largely through lack of evidence, but also, it seems, as the judge and Mrs. Cormac had taken pity on the expecting inmate. Around 1698 then, Anne entered the world with all the fanfare of a scandal that had half the town of Kinsale absolutely buzzing. Mr. Cormac was trying to navigate a double whammy of public disgrace. Not only had he knocked up his maid, but Mary was also a Catholic, a big hot potato. Bear in mind this was 17th century Ireland. The colony's financial and political elite, of which the Cormacs were members, were Protestant, and association with Catholics was disreputable. With James II having recently traipsed through the area in a failed attempt to reclaim the British throne, anti-Catholic sentiment was through the roof. When Mr. Cormac discovered that Mrs. Cormac was bearing twins with a lover of her own, in quite the hypocritical act of revenge, he pushed for the couple's split and they went on to live separately. At the same time, the proud Mr. Cormac attempted to save any remaining face he had as a practicing lawyer by distancing himself both from Mary and his daughter Anne. Eventually, though, he put his honour aside and, following the dictates of his heart, brought them under his roof. He was in love, it seems. So now we have a Protestant lawyer at an all-time low reputationally, in financial straits, shacking up with a Catholic mistress and his bastard daughter. And all this, I'll add, under the prying eyes and gossiping tongues of a very stuffy English elite. One thing Mr. Cormac did have going for himself, though, was an allowance from his now estranged wife, who had inherited a large sum from Mr. Cormac's mother. We're told the mother had attempted to mediate in the failing marriage, but had failed to sway her son into any form of reconciliation. Before she passed, she left an inheritance for Mrs. Cormac and the newborn twins, ouch for William, which Mrs. Cormac volunteered to split with her estranged husband. That said, if she caught wind of his cosy new living arrangements, well, he could bid that allowance adieu. So the old dog thought up a novel strategy, one which would keep the lifeline pumping away, while also keeping his darling daughter close to him. Anne would grow up dressing as a boy, and she did so posturing as an apprentice law clerk at her father's practice. Now you ask, how did this pan out? Well, if this really happened, on the one hand, Anne would have spent about 5 years under the same roof as a loving father, and in material terms at least, was pretty comfortable for an Irish Catholic girl at the time. On the other hand, living this double life must have taken its toll. She would have had a lonely upbringing. Contact with her peers would have been limited, likewise with her father's guests and clients. The gradual realization that her real identity was a handicap, if not an embarrassment for her father, no doubt left an imprint, and the secretive existence was likely suffocating. She was molded to tiptoe, disguise and hide, ever mindful of her father's rules and interdictions. The pressure, and perhaps even paranoia from her father, shouldn't be underestimated. She constantly had to be on her guard, suppressing her true self to avoid exposing the family to yet more scandal. At the same time, the tension of this double life toughened her up, made her more calculating and accustomed to living with secrecy as a survival. But even the best kept secrets come out in the wash. After about 5 years, Mrs. Cormac found out. Kinsale's gossip mill made damn sure of that. She promptly cut William off for good, forcing him to rely solely on his tanking legal practice. Fewer and fewer people wanted to hire a lawyer who couldn't get his own life in order. With this cover now blown, Mr. Cormac embraced full pariah status and continued to live with Mary and Anne, now public knowledge. Unable to tolerate the assault on her honour, Mrs. Cormac turned even more vindictive. She directed her wrath not just at her husband, but at the progeny of his scandalous adultery, Anne herself. We're told she threatened to have her banished from Kinsale without a penny to her name. The state of affairs pressed Mr. Cormac's hand. Despite alleged happiness as a family, now boldly reunited, the public pressure and financial situation had become unbearable. Mr. Cormac was ready to leave Kinsale. He sold what little he had left of his home and legal practice. His eyes were set on the new world, where the family could embark on a fresh start. It was the colony of South Carolina which offered the most tantalizing possibilities for the fledgling family. a new home where Irish and Scotch-Irish settlers had for decades eked out a modest living in the English colony, much freer from the political and religious instability of the British Isles. But a hasty departure came with dramatic consequences. William Cormac presumed outraged townspeople in Kinsale would try and prevent the family's migration from Kinsale, hoping for Mr. Cormac to face justice for his misdeeds. As the local sea captains were well tied to the aggrieved townspeople, we're told William and the family had to travel to the port of Cork while undercover to then set sail across the Atlantic. Anne, of course, was already well versed in the art of disguise. After the Great Escape and a weeks-long voyage, they landed in Charlestown, a freewheeling, multi-ethnic port city with blurring class and racial boundaries. The colony's history was intertwined with piracy from early on. Due to South Carolina's vulnerable location at the eastern point of a sprawling wilderness spanning inland towards the Appalachian Mountains, Carolinian merchants and settlers had become dependent on the flow of goods stolen by pirates, since legitimate goods were normally imported at inflated prices from England. The city's climate of religious tolerance and lax moral codes were ideal for a man like William Cormac, who'd grown tired of the sanctimony from the overly pious in his home county of Cork. Business was looking good too. Since South Carolina was governed by English common law, Cormac could continue with his legal practice as if he was still in Kinsale, minus the great smudge on his honour, and perhaps with more clients than ever before. With the shenanigans and smuggling from pirates, the city was in dire need of talented lawyers for all kinds of people and on both sides of the law. Charlestown would also have represented a kind of personal liberation for Anne. For the first time in her life, she wasn't saddled with the great burden of being a bastard. Back in Ireland, her status had cast her to the lowest rungs of the social ladder. Meanwhile, the city's religious tolerance meant she and her mother could identify and worship freely as Catholics. Gloriously united and unburdened by the stifling social constraints of class, religion, and scandal, William and Mary decided to marry. Eventually, William tried his hand at becoming a merchant, a far less scandal-prone occupation. He earned enough to start a rice and indigo plantation, and before long, the family had migrated north to the Black River region. As the business got started and the family settled into their new life, Anne matured within the nouveau riche planter tradition. She likely received a good education, perhaps under the privileged tutelage of a French Huguenot, with many having settled in the New World after fleeing Catholic France. Anne would also have led a dynamic outdoor life, from labour on the plantation to horse riding and hunting small game. Marksmanship was an essential skill, not just for sustenance in everyday settlers' life, but also for self-defense in the event of attacks from Native American tribes. With this new life, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, the Cormacs would live happily ever after, and Anne would eventually inherit the plantation, marry a planter herself, and live out the remainder of her days as a New World settler. This was not to be. Life had a way of keeping Anne on her toes, and by the time she was 15, tragedy struck again. Her dear mother, Mary, died of typhoid, a disease which had already claimed many lives in the coastal lowlands. Her passing wrecked father and daughter alike. Anne could wave goodbye to the short-lived privileges of a comfortable settler's life as she was thrust into the adult world, taking on the responsibilities of her mother. She was now head of the household, overseeing its daily upkeep and the domestic needs of her father. Not just this, she also helped William run the taxing operations of the plantation, and this from sunrise to sunset. The vacuum of her mother's death and the emotional toll it had on the pair gradually drove a wedge between them. William wasn't exactly a paragon of support during the grieving, and resentment from Anne brewed as she realized just how much of her life had been shaped by his chaotic decisions. Only a teenager, she likely blamed her father for her mother's death. The challenges of life whetted an already fiery temperament. In one incident, we're told she lashed out at a maid, even turning a knife on her. This is sensationalized as murderous intent by Anne's first biographer, but the latter is unlikely. As the daughter of a former maid, it's more likely her wrath was checked by an affinity with domestic workers. In any case, we can speculate that Anne, an only child with a troubled upbringing, and now more aggrieved than ever before, had a fierce temper which only hardened with time. She was also flourishing into a natural beauty, and at 16 or 17 began attracting suitors while developing an interest in young men herself. We're told that around this period she left the plantation, bound for Charlestown. She likely made the move with her father, spurred on by the slave revolt of 1714 and the ensuing Yamasee War that following year, which devastated the colony. In Charlestown, her looks, character and wealth made her a choice pick on the old marriage market. William had amassed a substantial fortune by this point, even buying up a sugar plantation in Jamaica. Suitors for Anne naturally flocked from all corners, from lusty tavern dwellers of Vice City to the wealthy sons of planters and merchants eager to cash in on her father's inheritance. We're told that one of these, after initially being accepted by Anne, was too aggressive for the young lady and was subsequently beaten by her. He ended up being hospitalized. Strong-willed, tempestuous, and wiser beyond her years, she navigated the vice and debauchery of Charlestown with flair, fending off artful suitors and the predations of lechers. Born into scandal, raised on secrets, and hardened by loss, Anne Bonny wasn't just a girl from a troubled family. She was becoming something far more interesting. A woman of unique strength of mind, impressive adaptability, and above all, a natural rebel. Captain Johnson's tale would have us believe that Anne met a somewhat dashing, low-ranked sailor named James Bonny in Charlestown and naively followed him to the Caribbean isle of Nassau like a love-struck fool. But here's a twist worth entertaining. Anne likely didn't trail after Bonny at all. It's far more plausible that she left Charlestown solo, seeking her own freedom, and only crossed paths with Bonny later. Anne was fed up with her life in South Carolina and the classist hypocrisies of its English upper crust, who might have cottoned on to her illegitimate birth and scandal-ridden background in Kinsale. Nassau, a disreputable, criminal, and virtually class-free society in the Caribbean, would have represented a new life for her, a clean slate, beyond her father's gaze and beyond the suffocations and snobberies of South Carolina. The only route to free herself was by the sea. Quick history on Nassau. Under Queen Elizabeth I, English privateers turned pillaging Spanish ships into a national pastime, all in the name of religion. A century later, Oliver Cromwell gave it a boost by seizing Jamaica from Spain in 1655, the first English colony in the Western Hemisphere taken by military force. Quite a trend that one would become. From there, Jamaica's governor issued countless letters of marque, practically inviting privateers to go after Spanish wealth. Port Royal soon became the it spot for these ventures. However, by the late 1600s, England had a change of heart. Privateering, it seemed, couldn't compete with the booming sugar and slave trades, so buccaneers found themselves out of favour. At first, buccaneers thrived by preying on slave ships, but soon even the Royal Navy had had enough of them meddling in trade. The sugar plantation owners, seeing their fortunes threatened, called for an end to buccaneering. With Port Royal devastated by an earthquake in 1692 and Jamaica's new anti-pirate stance, pirates needed a new HQ. Enter Nassau, on the Caribbean island of New Providence. Its shallow harbour was a dream for smaller ships and a nightmare for large Navy vessels, which helped turn the Bahamas into a pirate's haven. By the early 1700s, Nassau had its own economy, drawing former slaves, indentured servants, and disenfranchised sailors who created a fiercely egalitarian society, welcoming all who had grievances against the English crown. The Bahamian governor, Cadwallader Jones, even handed out privateering commissions for a cut of the loot. Now, Spain and France didn't take kindly to this. They attacked Nassau twice in the early 1700s. They dismantled the government, leaving the city in chaos and ripe for the formation of a pirate republic. By 1713, roughly 1,000 pirates were settled in the Bahamas. But back to our story. Once Anne had met James Bonny, there was no going back. Her father, naturally incensed by her decision to elope with a sea rover with no future, promptly disowned Anne. He had had hopes she would marry into wealth, befitting her social status, but clearly had failed to underestimate just how similar his daughter was to him. That is, naturally defiant, a lover of adventure and the fast life, while prepared to spit in the face of class conventions. Father and daughter became estranged thereafter, as Anne embarked on a new life with Bonny. No doubt the anger which her rebellion stirred in her father would have brought her some pleasure. Of course, their elopement more than echoed the bond Anne's own parents once had, united against a world that didn't accept them. Like Anne, James Bonny was a natural rebel, holding modern society with its cant and injustices in contempt. While described by Captain Johnson as, quote, not worth a groat, he would have had his charms. A roguish older Irishman with a silver tongue, and the romantic edge of his life choices no doubt drew in the young Anne. Suffice it to say, he clearly represented a ticket out of everything she hated in life. With that said, despite common belief, Anne didn't leave the English colony to embark on a life of piracy. She left for an elopement. She was young, after all, and her relatively sheltered life, it seems, left her clueless about Bonny's side job. She believed he was a hard-working seaman. Little did she realise her decision to elope with him would tie her fate to more infamy than she or her father had ever known. In late 1718, Anne and her husband arrived in New Providence. There, she would have experienced radical egalitarianism for the first time in her life. And as an Irish woman, with a natural aversion to British rule, she would have found herself enthralled by the anti-British sentiment of Bahamian pirates. We don't know the specifics of her relationship with Bonny. Some sources state he was acting as an informant to the local governor, offering information on his peers which Anne disapproved of. He could also have abandoned her for too long while out on the open seas. Whatever happened, and it could be a combination of the two, Anne grew disillusioned with the Union. By mid-1719, she made a fateful encounter which would set her on a path to personal freedom. The man she met was the legendary John Rackham, known to history as Calico Jack. His reputation preceded him. He was a smooth-talking gentleman pirate, renowned for his brave leadership and infinite reservoirs of charisma. Legend has it he donned colourful, unpretentious fabrics, particularly calico, for which he became famous. A ladies' man with a tribe of children in Cuba, he caught the eye of the young Irish beauty who could not resist his advances. The English-born Rackham towered above James Bonny on virtually all fronts. He'd risen to prominence as second in command under Captain Charles Vane, who'd led a crew on a sloop called the Ranger. Rackham had recently deposed his former captain in a democratically voted mutiny after Vane had proven too passive against a French man of war. After a later episode in Cuba, during which Rackham and his crew stole a captured English sloop from the Spanish Navy, he returned to Nassau, even obtaining a royal pardon. How exactly Rackham and Anne met is unknown, but meet they did. Bonny's long absences or shortcomings created fertile ground for welcome advances from Rackham, who was likely seen as a more than capable guardian in a dangerous pirate's nest like Nassau. Before long, Anne and Rackham were lovers. Some sources, including Johnson, have it that Rackham went to James Bonny and asked for Anne's hand in marriage. Bonny, as you might expect, flat out refused. Whether this happened or not, Anne left her first husband to join Rackham and his crew before the mast. To do so, in what was typically an all-male environment, she had to revert to something she had done for so long in her childhood, to dress as a man. We don't know how Anne internalized this, but it must have felt something like putting on an old coat, slipping seamlessly back into something once very familiar to her. But whereas under her father it had been an obligation just to cushion his chaotic decisions and cope with the particular burdens of her life, now it was a choice she was making herself. A conflicting sentiment. I don't want to overstate this as a sexual and psychological liberation, as many biographers have done. Finding herself disguising her real identity once again, even if for radically different reasons, is complex. She was, after all, still adapting to a man's world, even if this was now her own choice. At least she could be by the side of her new lover, finding her place among the Republic of Pirates, embracing the challenges of life on the open seas, and experiencing more equality, respect and freedom than she had ever experienced before. Rackham, we're told, had her assigned to the captain's personal staff, so she could shack up with him without raising too much suspicion from the crew. See, this is where the history is dubious and screams fictional embellishment. Could she really hold up her disguise, living in close quarters with a crew of about a dozen sailors? How many films have we watched where a lady dresses up as a man, something which is totally obvious to the viewer, but unrealistically not to the characters? What's more likely is, while there might have been some attempts to conceal her identity towards the start, it was soon too difficult to keep up the act. There was likely some initial disgruntlement and contempt from some of the crew members, common superstitions at the time entailed that women brought bad luck. Others saw them as unwelcome sources of distraction for the crew and not physically or emotionally capable of performing the everyday tasks needed to man a ship. However, through the respect that Rackham and his authority commanded, alongside the fact that Anne was proving herself as more than a capable pirate, her womanhood, it seems, no longer became cause for protest. It's even stated she eventually dropped the disguise while on board and only cross-dressed during raids. All reports suggest she was excelling in her duties. She had all the makings for it. Her plantation days on the South Carolina frontier guaranteed her more than familiarity with firearms, while her time fending off reprobates in Charlestown or alongside Bonny in pirate-infested Nassau meant she was already accustomed to the coarse and disreputable ways of her fellow crew members and knew how to navigate them with skill. Her fiery temperament and quick tongue made her a force not to be crossed. Her resilient and adventurous spirit, forged by years spent overcoming challenges, rendered her exceptionally bold in both combat and in the face of adversity. Her resourcefulness brought creativity and a strong strategic mind for the successful and continued running of the ship. No doubt she was a valued advisor and confidant to Rackham, and the respect she got from her strength, in turn, would have made her more empowered on the ship, a proactive force, not a reactive one, as she had been for much of her life. By the summer of 1719, Anne had fallen pregnant. She was whisked off to Cuba for pirate-style maternity leave under the care of Rackham's friends there. She gave birth in February 1720 before leaving the firstborn behind to return to that sweet, sweet pirate life. In the summer of 1720, Rackham gathered a new crew in Nassau, 12-person strong. Joining was a woman known to history as Mary Read. You might have heard of her. Like Anne, Mary had had her fair share of cross-dressing in life, both as an infantryman at Flanders during the War of Spanish Succession and as a sailor on an English man of war. By the end of her life, she had had two husbands, a Dutch soldier and a pirate. Both died, the second was hanged. While on a ship bound for the West Indies, her crew was subdued by English pirates. She became a pirate herself, accepted a royal pardon, privateered, and then ultimately returned to piracy, intertwining her fate with Rackham and Anne Bonny's. On the 22nd of August 1720, the new crew stole a sloop called the William under the cover of darkness out of Nassau Harbour, making it their new flagship. It was a small but swift sloop of about 12 tons, carrying 4 carriage guns and 2 swivels. Captain Johnson describes the theft as a well-planned operation involving Anne visiting the ship beforehand and asking questions about the captain and the activities of the crew. The crew sneaked onto the ship around midnight, apprehending 2 crew members caught off guard, before bluffing their way past the harbour's guard ship and fort with an excuse involving a broken anchor cable. Pirate legend would have us believe that Mary and Anne, with their kindred backstories and cross-dressing history, developed a romantic relationship behind Rackham's back. The legend goes even further to state the 3 were lovers in a polyamorous affair. We do have to be exceptionally wary of these claims. This is catnip for sensationalist historians writing after the period, whose favour for historical veracity was often surpassed by a desire to sell copies. Sex sells, as it always has done. The material, after all, makes for great storytelling, with the cross-dressing lesbian romance being an enticing literary tradition at the time the works were written. Besides this, Mary also had her common-law husband on board. Modern biographer Philip Tucker states, quote, Given human nature and the dictates of the heart, the possibility does exist that the two women had a romantic affair, which might even have been a welcome respite from their male lovers who failed to fulfill certain needs. Of course, there's the possibility, just as it's possible Rackham had affairs with his male crew members, but that doesn't mean it's true. Following the theft of the William, Bahamas Governor Woodes Rogers posted a warrant for the crew's arrest in early September 1720. A crew of 45 pirate hunters was now on Rackham's. More than double the number followed later on another sloop after reports of ongoing piracy around New Providence attributed to Rackham's crew. Once Rackham learned about the proclamations, the crew set sail for Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. We know that in early October, they stole from 2 merchant vessels off the coast of Hispaniola and sailed onwards towards Jamaica, where they pilfered off of small vessels. During these raids, we also know that they took on some of their victims through recruitment or coercion, perhaps to replenish the crew following losses from disease, desertion, or combat. They were now on the radar of the governor of Jamaica, Nicholas Laws. Rackham's pirating along the northern coast left a string of survivors and witnesses, allowing Laws to track the crew's movements and, better still, to predict them. By November, the crew had sailed the length of Jamaica and decided to anchor about a league off Negril Bay, the island's westernmost point. During their stopover one evening, they came across a band of 9 English turtle fishermen. They convinced them to come on board for a bowl of punch, and, true to pirate form, spent the night getting absolutely sloshed with them. All of them, we're told, except Anne and Mary. A fateful error. A privateer named Captain Jonathan Barnett had approached the William at dusk, suspecting a gang of pirates after the sight of gunfire had alerted his colleague. When the pirates saw the sloop, Rackham ordered the drunken crew to weigh anchor and sail off. The turtle fishermen were coerced into assistance. Some of Rackham's crew stayed on board to row away, while many others remained below deck, still drinking. Barnett eventually fired a shot at the sloop and raised British colours. A verbal exchange followed, and after a show of defiance from Rackham, the William fired. Barnett responded with a full broadside and a volley of small arms fire, which shattered the boom on the William's main mast. All of the fishermen fled below the decks, alongside some of the pirates. Barnett sailed alongside and swarmed the ship. Now, Captain Johnson has a different retelling. By his account, Rackham and his entire crew scrambled below deck almost as soon as Barnett opened fire, after failing in a drunken frenzy to successfully operate the ship. And once Barnett's men had boarded the William, only 2 of Rackham's crew stayed above deck, and these were Mary and Anne. In a last stand, they fought shoulder to shoulder against Barnett's men, while their comrades cowered in the ship's guts. It was a formidable sight. Such was the woman's rage towards her comrades, we're told that Mary fired her pistols into the floorboards, killing one and injuring others. The pirates held the men off for some time, but there were too many. As they closed in, the women were overrun and wrestled to the floor. Disarmed of their cutlasses and pistols, all they could do was squirm and curse at their fates and the cowardice of their fellow sailors. Rackham's crew was turned over to a Major Richard James of the Jamaican militia and carted off to the capital. After a 3-day trial in St. Diego de la Vega, the men were charged, convicted, and hanged in November of 1720. The corpses of 3, including Rackham's, were gibbeted in chains at key local sites as grisly warnings against the crimes of piracy. Just as the crew was leaving the city in chains to meet their ends, Johnson tells us Rackham was granted one final request. He asked his jailers to see Anne, the mother of his born and unborn children, just one last time. So, in a dank, unforgiving cell, a shell of his former self, he was visited by the woman whom he'd promised a thrilling life of adventure and love on the open seas, free from modern society with all its hypocrisies and woes, the woman he swore to protect, and who in turn interlaced her life and destiny with his. Anne granted him his final wish, but perhaps Rackham should have anticipated the stinging last words from a betrayed lover. As all the comfort she could afford him, we're told, was that she regretted seeing him there, but if he had fought like a man in the couple's greatest hour of need, he needn't be hanged like a dog. Then came the trial for Anne and Mary, beginning on the 28th of November 1720. In the proceedings, it was derived from copious witness statements that Anne and Mary were not just key individuals in the everyday runnings of the ship, not to mention in a string of pirate raids in which they were seen brandishing pistols and machetes, but that they clearly held some undefined leadership roles. These revelations tipped the balance against their favour, wiping away any previous suspicions of them as loyal wives or concubines of the real criminal males. Rather, they were proactive and pivotal members of the crew, not low-key conspirators and enablers in piracy. With that, Anne and Mary were found guilty and sentenced to hang. It was at this point, we're told by Captain Johnson, that Anne mustered up all her inner strength and intelligence to defend Mary and herself. As both were in their second trimester of pregnancy, they pled the belly. Was this her own research, external legal counsel, or perhaps even the memory of her father's ramblings on obscure legal precedents? Perhaps it was a mix. In any case, before a jury of some of the most powerful noblemen in the Caribbean, we're told she claimed the precedent that pregnant women are not to be hanged, thus delaying her and Mary's executions until after childbirth. And this was upheld. Neither one of them, ladies and gentlemen, ever hanged. Mary Read and her unborn child died in prison in April 1721. Anne's fate, however, is unknown. Some hold that her father had bribed the court to release her under a false name after hearing about the trial through his connections as a planter in Jamaica. Her alleged descendants claim she did survive and went on to remarry, bearing 6 more children and living a peaceful life in Virginia until her death in April of 1782, aged 81. Whatever her fate, Anne Bonny's story is one for the ages. Not only was she unique for being a female pirate in the golden age of piracy, but her life story reveals an unbending spirit and will in spite of a chaotic upbringing. A confession is, there's no concrete record of the Cormacs from Cork, or of Anne's last stand with Mary, or her final encounter with Rackham for that matter. Besides the criminal activities of the Rackham crew, their downfall in Negril Bay, and the details of the trial, much of Anne's story is based on conjecture, hearsay, or pure invention, chiefly from the dubious work of Captain Johnson. So I apologise to those more interested in the unvarnished history than the legendary story, but I hope you enjoyed the show. If anything, it's a story of valiance and rebellion, of a girl from a broken home, savvy enough not just to despise the hypocrisies of the lands she came from, but to openly defy them. Whether they be the sexual, religious, or societal restrictions placed on her through her bastard status, her Catholic mother, or her freedoms under a mercantilist English order full of self-serving sanctimony. State-backed privateers, after all, were up to the same shenanigans as pirates. Instead of serving king, country, homeland, or religion, she chose the high seas for adventure, freedom, and more equality than was possible for a woman of her rank and status. Her story, if not a legend, can only persist as one of a female icon. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Hey, if you enjoyed it, why not give the channel a subscribe?